This is lecture 2 for PSYC1040, and the topic of today's lecture is going to be the science of psychology. I've put my contact details up again, so be sure if you don't have my email address that you write it down, and also if you're on Twitter, you can find me at Social Nero. I want you to think a little bit about what psychology is like today, and how diverse all the different psychologists are in terms of what they study, what they do for an occupation, and so on. And as we think about that, let's think about what unifies psychology. Now, as I said, there are many psychologists out there doing all sorts of different kinds of things. For instance, if you look at the American Psychological Association, or the APA, which is the world's largest psychological organization, representing mainly psychologists in the United States, but has members from all over the world, they currently have a membership of 117,500 members. 117,500 psychologists belong to the APA. And in fact, they have many different interests. The APA itself is made up of many different divisions. You can see here a list of some of them: the Society for General Psychology, the Society for Clinical Psychology, number 20, Adult Development and Aging, 26, Society for the History of Psychology, 30, the Society of Psychological Hypnosis, and so on. In fact, there are 54 divisions of the American Psychological Association, so 54 different ways it gets cut up in terms of people who have specific interests that could be different from somebody else's interest as a psychologist. So there is a lot of diversity. If we even look closer to home, to the Australian Psychological Society, which is the largest representation of psychologists in Australia, the APS, it currently has 22,000 members, and this is what their website looks like. I recommend that you check it out sometime. In fact, it has a student membership available. But the APS itself is made up of a large number of different groups. And here's actually from their website. They say the functions of the APS are conducted through the national office in Melbourne with a staff of over 110 people, and through the voluntary contributions of APS members through 199 active member groups within the society. There are 40 APS branches spread across Australia, 9 APS colleges representing specialty areas within this profession: clinical neuropsychology, clinical psychology, counseling, forensic, and so on, and 41 interest groups representing the wide range of special interests of the APS membership. So look, even a much smaller organization here in Australia has a great diversity of interests by psychologists, and they very often have very little in common with each other because they have such completely different interests. Even if you look at some of the psychology journals that we have, many different kinds of psychology journals, there's a few hundred of them, in fact. This is just a small sampling just to give you an idea of like the great range of topics that people study in psychology: psychological review, psychology of music, the counseling psychologist, political psychology, and so on. Again, a great amount of diversity in psychology. So I put all that up mainly to illustrate to you that there's just a wide range of interests in psychology. So that goes back to this question: what unifies psychology? What makes us all call ourselves psychologists? And I would say the answer to that question is that we follow this quest to understand behavior using the methods of science. So we are a science-based discipline. We look at mind and behavior, but we use methods of science to do this. So that's why we spend time right at this point talking a little bit about exactly what is science. So what is science? Well, science is not just a bunch of facts or a pile of knowledge that we've accumulated. It's actually a process for acquiring knowledge about the world. So it's a way that we have chosen as psychologists to understand the world in terms of mind and behavior. Just think about a little bit of what the alternatives would be to science. I'm going to go ahead and illustrate for you 4 different ways that we might know about the world, 4 ways of knowing. One of our choices, one of our alternatives, is just personal experience. That is, we can just say, well, based on my personal experience, things that have happened to me, these are the things that I know, and then go ahead and make judgments about things based on that. So you could just use whatever kind of past experience you have to make judgments about things in the present, and it would just be based on your personal experience. So it's a way of knowing, right? We all do this. This is how we learn things and so on. Let me give you an example, though, where our personal experience could lead us astray. For instance, look at this sequence of numbers: 2, 4, 6. And I say to you, okay, what is the rule for how I generated the numbers? How did I come up with 2, 4, 6? What other combinations would fit this rule? And more importantly, what is my rule? So some people might say, well, you're just doing even numbers. You went 2, 4, 6, so the next number would be 8, 10, 12. That's a possibility. That could be what the rule is based on your personal experience. But it actually turns out that my rule is just generate 3 numbers that are increasing in order, that they have an ascending order. So it could have been 1, 3, 5, 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7. I just said my rule was pick 3 numbers that increase in order. Now, you wouldn't have known that, and you don't have a good way of figuring that out, but you use your own personal experience to make a guess as to what this rule was. And this, in fact, is known as the confirmation bias. It's this tendency for people to search for confirmation of what they already believe. So they see 2, 4, 6, and so then they would want to test that with an 8. That they're seeking some rule that they already have, and then they look for evidence of that in the world. And it's all just based on personal experience, which again could cause you to make mistakes, to cause you to make the wrong inference. So that's one of our ways that we can know about the world, is just from personal experience. A second alternative would be the method of authority. We've all appealed to authority for knowledge. You're doing it right now by listening to what I'm saying and maybe even writing it down. And this is because you believe that, with my degree and the things that I've studied and so on, I must know what I'm talking about. And believe me, you've had some good reasons for doing that. But of course, we can't all be experts on everything. So we do have to appeal to authorities on some point. But the problem is you don't know if this knowledge that I'm passing on to you or that any expert is giving to you is directly verifiable. How do you know for sure that I'm not giving you the wrong advice or the wrong information? It doesn't have to actually be just an expert professor type person. It could be maybe a sacred scripture. It could be a political figure. Whoever it is, they might present themselves as actually being quite confident about the knowledge that they're passing on to you. But of course, they may be making a mistake. They could be lying to you. You just don't have any guarantee of the logical evaluation of these data. So that's the problem with the method of authority. Even though it comes in handy quite a bit when we're learning about things, we always have to be skeptical, like it could be wrong. Alternative 3, a third way of knowing, is to use reason, or another way of calling this is rationalism. And so this just means that you're going to go ahead and be logical, and you're going to make deductions based on observations that you have or some premise that you might have started out with, and just use the rational method of doing this. And syllogisms are kind of an example of this, where you could have a sound premise that leads to a sound conclusion. So your premise might be that all men are mortal. Richard is a man, and so therefore you conclude Richard is mortal. So you're using that premise, and then you've gone ahead and made a further observation, and because of that, then you go ahead and conclude then that therefore Richard is mortal. The problem with reason or rationalism, of course, is that flawed premises can lead to flawed conclusions. So even though you're correctly being logical, correctly using your reason, you might have started out with a flawed premise to begin with. Like, so for instance, attractive people are good. That could be your premise. Then you say, well, Natalie is attractive, therefore Natalie is good. You don't know if Natalie is good because maybe that premise about attractive people being good is actually wrong. So the problem with syllogism is that they really depend on that first premise being truthful and correct, and very often they could be flawed. And so just because you're using reason and logic doesn't necessarily mean you're always going to end up with a true conclusion. A fourth way of knowing is empiricism. And basically empiricism is knowledge that you get gained through objective observation. So you're making observations of the world, but you're doing this as objectively as possible. And you can use any of your senses: seeing, hearing, tasting, touching. And so you go ahead and observe things with your eyes, you hear things and so on, and you try to measure them, and you try to write them down, and you try to make your observations as objective as possible. The problem with this, though, is that observation sometimes isn't going to be enough. That just because you have the observation doesn't mean that you understood the phenomenon, that you can explain exactly what happened. So empiricism, even though it focuses on this objective observation, maybe using measurements and using scales and so on, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to understand what's going on because you can't observe everything that's going on. So you still may end up having to use some logic in order to make deductions about what's happening. So that's where we get back to science. That science really is a way of gaining knowledge with those last two methods. It's really a merger of rationalism and empiricism. The empirical part is the systematic observation and collection of data that we do in science, where we are going to make precise observations, try to be as objective as possible so that we have sound premises. And then the rational part is going to be the formulation of hypotheses and theories that we get from making these observations, and then we can further test them with more observations, those hypotheses and theories. So the way of knowing of science, this fifth way then really is this merger of rationalism and empiricism. So again, science is a process. You want to think of it as not just like the science of psychology is everything you get in a textbook. It's a way of actually doing things, a way that we acquire information about mind and behavior. It's a way of thinking about and observing the universe that leads to a deeper understanding of its workings. It includes systematic observation, critical analysis of data and theories. It's also tentative. It's got a tentative acceptance of current theories, and that we're never going to feel 100% confident that we really know everything, because excuse me, there may be an observation that we're missing. Maybe we need to run one more experiment. Maybe we need to collect some other data. Maybe we haven't actually tested people in this particular culture. So whatever our theory is currently, we want to view it as being something that's tentative, that could change with new data. It's also open. That means that other people can see the way we're thinking and the way they can see our observations, so we share all of this. And we try to have independence from authority. That means we try not to rely on the method of authority as much as possible in science. It's generally concerned with solvable problems. That means that we generally are going to focus on things that science can actually figure out the answers to. If science couldn't possibly provide an answer to a particular question, we don't tend to include that in the realm of science, and particularly when we're talking about mind and behavior, we would include that in psychology. Final thing just to mention is that science assumes determinism. And determinism means basically that everything has a cause. So we're going to assume that when we see some phenomenon occur, that there was a cause to it. And then if we're systematic in our observations and using rationalism, that we'll be able to determine what the cause was. And maybe even that cause has a cause, and so on. So it's assuming that things are caused by other things, and that's what we mean by determinism. Now, all of that, the science stuff that we've just been talking about, let's just relate this back now to experiments in statistics and psychology and try to figure out why do we do what we do then in psychology. Well, again, we very often will use experiments in psychology. It's one of our gold standards for collecting knowledge about mind and behavior in psychology. And so these experiments are formal ways of observing and experiencing the world. We can go back to almost 200 years ago when John Stuart Mill, a philosopher, actually talked about these kinds of methods of learning about the world and kind of an early version of psychology. He actually talked about these two important things that he said that we should try to do when we're trying to understand the world. He talked about the method of agreement. So if you're trying to figure out the cause of something else, if X is the cause, then it should cause Y. So whenever X appears and you make X happen, then you should see Y happen. That's what he called the method of agreement. So Y is always preceded by X. X is the cause of Y. That's the method of agreement. And so you try to show that in your experiments. But equally important to John Stuart Mill is you also in your experiments need to show the method of disagreement, that if you don't have X, then you shouldn't get Y. So Y should never appear when there is no X around. So if X isn't happening, because X is the cause of Y, then you shouldn't see Y happen either. So that's another important feature of research, is that you should have a way of showing that if not X, then not Y, this method of disagreement. In our basic experiments, we include John Stuart Mill's ideas of method of agreement and the method of disagreement, in that our experimental conditions are usually the way we demonstrate the method of agreement. So in an experimental condition that we might have, we're going to have one level of our independent variable and hope that we're going to see an effect on the dependent variable. If we see that, that's if X then Y. That's our method of agreement that John Stuart Mill wrote about. If we also include, though, a control condition where we don't have that particular level of the independent variable, then we shouldn't see Y on our dependent variable. So control conditions are a way of demonstrating the method of disagreement. If not X, then not Y. So that's the basic logic of why we have experimental conditions and why we have control conditions in experiments. Now, statistics, why we have those is they enable us to evaluate any claims we might want to make based on our observations. Statistics is the science of collecting and organizing, summarizing, and analyzing information to draw conclusions or answer questions. That's something we talked about at the last lecture. So statistics have this way of collecting and organizing and analyzing and stuff, so we can, in the end, make some conclusion about our experiment. So really, statistics is part of the rationalism part of the whole science process in psychology. We're using statistics to help us make logical deductions. There's different kinds of statistics in psychology. One kind of branch of statistics that we talk about is descriptive statistics. This is basically when we just organize and summarize the information that's collected. So actually the first few weeks when we start talking about statistics, about week 4, 5, 6, and 7, we're going to be talking a lot then about descriptive statistics, ways that you can use statistics to talk about things like the mean or the standard deviation. So these are ways of organizing and summarizing the information that you've collected. Inferential statistics is this other important branch of statistics, and this is actually probably the part that dominates most of your undergraduate training in statistics, is to learn about inferential statistics. And these are methods that allow us to take results obtained from a sample and then extend them to a population, and it tells us how reliable our result is. So we generally work with small groups of people, small groups of animals, that we call a sample, and then we try to make some conclusions about them that we can then extend to the population. And inferential statistics allow us to do that and also give us a measure of the reliability of our result. Now, let's go ahead and just talk about a real-world example where all this kind of comes together. Now, this isn't really a psychological example, it really comes from medicine, but it shows a lot of the same features that we've been talking about. So for instance, in 1987, there was a new drug that was possibly going to help people who were HIV infected or had AIDS. In fact, in 1987, the US FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, was faced with thousands of people dying of AIDS. And AIDS destroys the white blood cells, disabling the body's defenses against infection. The Public Health Department predicted that by 1992, they would have 54,000 people who would die of AIDS. So there was a huge crisis then in 1987, but if you reach that number by 1992, that would mean that more people would have died from AIDS than had died in the Vietnam War from the US. Now, in 1987, there was no cure, no proven treatment for people. Once they had AIDS, it was pretty much a death sentence. But this new medicine, AZT, was looking promising. And AIDS patients who had been given it were displaying increased appetites and weight gains. Now, what they had done was some controlled research, some experiments where they had an experimental condition and a control condition. And they found when you gave a group of patients the AZT, 1 out of 145 of them ultimately would have died by the end of the experiment. So just 1 person out of 145 patients given the AZT died. Compared with the other condition, which was the placebo. And in that condition, they found that 19 out of 137 patients who were given a placebo had passed away by the end of the experiment. What you can see then is that they're following John Stuart Mill's method of agreement and method of disagreement. So we have our method of agreement is our experimental group. So these are the people, we think AZT, when you have it as a cause, it causes people to live longer. And so that would be the Y. So if X, then Y. And that's what the experimental group represents. The method of disagreement is, okay, now if I don't have X, do I still get Y? Do people still live longer? Okay, and so those are our 2 conditions here. So the question then was, is this actually due to the AZT, or was it just due to chance? It's not a clear-cut result right now, right? It isn't like everybody who had AZT didn't get it, didn't die, and everybody who didn't did die. Even if both groups were actually given a placebo, we wouldn't expect that the mortality rate to be exactly the same in the 2 groups. It could just have been just by chance that you happen to get those particular outcomes. Maybe people by chance in one group were healthier than people in the other group anyway. So that's where the statistics comes in. That's where inferential statistics were used to figure out what the odds of getting these differences just by chance. And the statistical test showed that the odds of these differences occurring by chance was actually only 1 out of 1,000. So it's a very small chance that you would have gotten this kind of result if the AZT didn't have any effect, and it was just all chance. So it was just 1 out of 1,000 chance. And that's good, because usually our statistical convention in research is that we're happy if we can show that something happens less than 5 out of 100. And if it's something that happens that rarely, we consider that to be a significant effect, and that we can go ahead and say that we really do have an effect. So in this case, the researchers concluded that AZT was having a significant effect on the mortality rate of people who had AIDS. This was much better than the 5 out of 100 statistical convention, and so they made the inference that their AZT really was having an effect. So there's a real-world example where you can kind of see all of those, the method, the science, and the statistics being put together. Now, the thing I haven't really talked about very much yet is theory. So let's just cut to Oprah or Dr. Phil or some favorite talk show, and let's just say we have a guest on today, and the psychologist is Dr. Alfred Pontificate. And Dr. Pontificate has a theory of birth order, and this is based on the idea that the course of one's life is set by family interactions that are determined by birth orders. This is actually a pretty old idea in psychology. It's been around almost 100 years. That it matters if you're firstborn, if you're a middle child, or your last child, that somehow that's going to affect what happens in your life because of what your order of your birth was. So he's been talking about this on the show, and somebody from the audience says, well, my brother is a self-destructive workaholic. He ignores his wife and family. His work comes first, he has an ulcer, he drinks too much. So Dr. Pontificate asks, well, what is his birth order? And the answer from the audience member, well, he's the oldest of the children. And Dr. Pontificate answers, well, this is very common according to my theory of birth order. Parents transfer their life hopes and frustrations to their firstborn, even unconsciously. We call this the dynamic expectation spiral. It generates a pathological need for achievement. All right, so there's a theory. Theory saying that if you're the firstborn, you're the oldest, you're going to be subject to this dynamic expectation spiral, and you'll end up having a pathological need for achievement. That's his theory. But let's say that there's another person in the audience who asks this question. Well, my brother is also a firstborn. My parents sent him to university, and he dropped out after a year. Now he's living in a retreat on some mountaintop, weaving baskets. Dr. Pontificate comes back. Yes, this also happens. This is when the dynamic expectation spiral short circuits. In this case, the individual develops a wish to thwart the wish transference. The individual then goes through life rejecting conventional achievement aspirations. Now, notice that we have kind of like the method of agreement and the method of disagreement here. That in the sense that we have X, and in the first case, X seems to cause Y. And then over here, we have question 2, where the person's also a firstborn, have an X, but there is no Y. And yet, Dr. Pontificate says that both observations fit with the theory. You'll notice that the observations are almost directly opposite of each other, yet Dr. Pontificate is comfortable arguing that the theory can explain both observations. Doesn't make much sense when you think about it from a logical point of view. How could a theory account for both the absence and the effect? Right? So you got the effect in one case, and you have the absence of the effect in the other, and he says it's all the same theory. This is a problem that some psychological theories have, and it's something we need to watch out for when someone proposes a new theory. In this instance, one of the things that this particular theory of Dr. Pontificate's violates is the falsifiability principle. And the falsifiability principle was first coined or talked about by the philosopher Bertrand Russell, who talked about a celestial teapot or a cosmic teapot. And this was basically his idea, that he says that if you're going to go ahead and claim that there's something out there, that like there's a big gigantic teapot floating out in space, you have to actually show the proof for it. You can't just let somebody else come up with the evidence for that. And so what he was really trying to argue here is that you have to be able to prove something. You have to propose a theory in which not only that you're going to provide proof, but it should also be something that you could disprove. There should be a way for us to show that it doesn't happen. If there is a giant teapot just floating around out in space, how in the world could we possibly disprove that, right? So if you went out looking for it, and you could say, well, the reason why you haven't found it yet is because it's behind Venus. And then when you go looking behind Venus, it's moved and it's now behind the sun. The issue is that there's no reason to propose a celestial teapot if you can't also disprove that it exists, if it's not possible to test whether it does or doesn't exist. So you have to have a way of being wrong. Your theory that you have should have a way for someone to be able to show that it's wrong. Now, it could still be that it's correct all the time, but there should be a way to test that it could be incorrect. And you'll notice that in Dr. Pontificate's example, even when he has evidence that goes contrary to his theory, that seems to be, he still thinks that the theory isn't been shown wrong. And so therefore, he's got basically an unfalsifiable theory that explains everything. And that is not a good psychological theory. We'll come back to this, but I wanted to mention that there's actually been some recent research just on this very question about birth order and personality that was just published about a year ago. And it was published in the Journal of Research and Personality. And basically what they did is they looked at a large sample of high school students and looked at their birth order and their personality and measured lots of different aspects about them. If you just jump to the conclusion here, you can see it says this study helps establish reliable effect size estimates for birth order on personality, on intelligence. And it's a large number. It's like 377,000 people. And what they found was a very tiny correlation between birth order and personality, a correlation of around 0.02, which suggests that basically birth order really is not very important at all, as much as we like to think it is and how much people have talked about it for 100 years in psychology. All right, back to talking about science. So again, just highlighting some of the main features, some of the main principles we've talked about, is that it involves empiricism. So we're going to make careful observations. We're going to have skepticism, which means that we want to be able to know that something can be falsified, right? We want to be able to be skeptical about someone's claims, to look at it and say, well, how good is this evidence? Could there be a better explanation for it? That openness means that we're going to be open to the fact that new things could come along and we may need to change our mind, which also relates to, openness also means that we can share our data and that other people can see our observations and understand why we came to these particular conclusions. Tentativeness is the idea that we are going to hold on to these claims, these conclusions, not very tightly, because some new evidence could come along that would cause us to change our conclusions. And finally, independence from authority. We don't tend to lean on what some authority figure tells us in psychology, some great Sigmund Freud or B.F. Skinner or something like that. We're going to instead try to rely on the evidence that we collect. Now, in terms of some goals for science, I just want to briefly mention these are kind of our goals of why we're doing all this. One of the goals is to basically describe. So one of the aspects of the scientific endeavor in psychology is just to describe things. So we want to see what happens. We want to be able to know like what the violence rate is for people who have this particular personality factor. We want to know what are the causes of depression. So that's just description, right? So we go out and collect data to describe what's happening in psychological processes. Another goal, though, is that we want to explain what's happening. And so we want to be able to say, can we figure out why these particular thoughts lead to depression? Like, can we understand how this all works in the mind, that the brain can somehow take particular thoughts and go over them over and over and over again until it causes a person to become depressed? And so if we can explain that with a good theory, that's great. That's one of the goals of science. We also want to make predictions, so we should be able to take these explanations that we have and make predictions about what things we can expect in the future. That's a good way of testing our explanations, is that we can make predictions about things that happen. And finally, control means that ultimately what we'd like to be able to do is control things like maybe wipe out cancer. We want to be able to help reduce the suicide rate and so on. That's what we mean by control. That a goal of science is if we've accumulated enough knowledge and we understand the way things work, we should be able to use that then to improve things, to be able to control things and have more control over the apparent randomness that might happen in our everyday life. Okay, I'm going to move on now and talk about the scientific method, the way that we might do it here in psychology. And these are kind of like the stages of psychological research. And you can see we start with theory, go down to prediction or hypothesis, design a study, collect some data, and then we have arrows going either way to summarize or to analyze. We're going to end up maybe writing a report, maybe repeat the experiments, and then look at our theory again. All right, so what I'm going to be doing today and at the next lecture is kind of going through these stages in psychological research in more detail. This kind of outlines a lot of what we're going to be covering in the next couple weeks. So we've talked about theory. This is really the starting point for all good psychology research, is that we want to understand what existing theory is. It's not saying that you need to come up with your own theory. It's saying perhaps instead what you need to do is read in the literature and find out what other people have come up with theories and look for some observations that people have already talked about and possibly theorized about. And based on all that, you'll have a theory that you can either design yourself, or you can go ahead and improve upon from what somebody else had talked about. Then you take this theory and you're going to try to derive predictions or hypotheses from it that you can then test and research. And this prediction or hypothesis is going to be that you're going to see that one variable is related to changes in another variable. So you're going to want to make precise kinds of predictions to say things like, if I increase the loudness in the room, I'm going to see people do worse on this particular test, or whatever it happens to be. That's your prediction hypothesis, and it comes from the theory, this bigger explanation that you started out with in the beginning. Now, we usually start out, though, with two hypotheses. There are two kinds of hypotheses that we're going to test at this point. One kind of hypothesis is known as the null hypothesis, and it's got this designation of H with a little sub O, or 0. And the null hypothesis basically says that there is no relationship between the memorability of names and the perception of names. Basically, it's saying that there's no relationship between the variables that I'm studying. That's what a null hypothesis is. So null means nothing, right? So you're hypothesizing that there is no relationship between X and Y, right? So that's a null hypothesis. You always want to state that. You always want to start out by stating in your research what the null hypothesis would be, that there is no relationship between whatever the two variables are that you're interested in. The alternative hypothesis, H sub 1, is that there is a relationship between X and Y. So this is your alternative to the null, and you're basically saying something like, there is a relationship between the memorability of names and the perception of names. And you could be really precise, and you could say something like, more memorable names will be perceived as more frequent compared to less memorable names, or something like that. But you basically can see that in these specific alternative hypotheses, you're coming up with very specific alternatives to the null hypothesis, which says there isn't any relationship. Now, this thing about the null and the alternative hypothesis is going to come up again and again throughout the semester. So I'm introducing it in this lecture, but I'll be coming back to it again and again. Don't worry too much if you're not completely understanding it, but by middle of the semester or so, you're going to understand very clearly what the difference between a null and an alternative hypothesis is. Then based on that null and that alternative hypothesis, you're going to go ahead and design your study. You want to come up with what the experiment is, or whatever it is, so that you can test this relationship between X and Y. So the research design is the foundation of your study. If you don't design this very well, it's kind of shaky, then a lot of conclusions that you're going to draw are going to also be shaky, and they won't be very good. What you want to do is, in the research design, is to specify the kinds of variables that you have. And what we usually do is we talk about in experiments an independent variable, or the IV. This is the variable that you independently manipulate by the experimenter. So as the experimenter, you're going to have control over this. It's something that you can basically say that some people are in this condition, other people are going to be in that condition. So that's the variable that you can manipulate in the experiment. It's also sometimes called a factor, or an explanatory variable, or a predictor variable, depending on the kind of research design you're working on. Independent variables have levels. So IVs, that's the way we're going to abbreviate this, have levels. So you can set the basic IV would have just two levels, like the experimental group and the control group. But you could have maybe 3 levels. You could say no words have to be memorized, 5 words have to be memorized, or 20 words have to be memorized. So now I've got 3 conditions. I have 3 levels of my independent variable. And then, of course, you have dependent variables in research. And the dependent variable is something that you're measuring, some attribute, some characteristic of behavior, something that you believe changes as a result of the changes in the independent variable, if you're talking about an experiment. Or maybe this dependent variable you think is related to another dependent variable. Okay, so the reason why it's called a dependent variable is that we're saying it's dependent on the values of other variables. We hypothesize that this y variable changes as a function of other variables, like an x or a z or some other variable that's out there. Okay, so that's the dependent variable. Now, if you take this and go back to our hypotheses that we talked about, we said that there was a null hypothesis and that there was a researcher alternative hypothesis, HO and H1. In the null hypothesis condition, we're saying that there's no effect. There's no relationship between the IV and the DV. Whereas the research hypothesis, or the alternative hypothesis, H1, is that we think that there is a relationship between the IV and the DV. I've put here in brackets direction unknown because you don't actually always have to say which way you think the IV affects the DV, but the logical complement to saying that there's no effect is just to say that there is an effect. There is a relationship between the IV and the DV. Okay, so again, that's just a quick overview of how things like IVs and DVs fit in with our predictions or our hypotheses. So you're basically then going to be designing an experiment around your IV, how you're going to manipulate it, how people in your study are going to experience it, and what measures you're going to collect on it. And then you basically go out and collect your data. You run your experiment. So you now have a big pile of data. And at the end of that, you're now going to need to analyze it. You're going to run some statistical tests to see if you can go ahead and make conclusions about the population from your sample. But you're also going to organize it and display it, look at the means and so on, make some graphs to talk about it. And possibly maybe your data didn't come out, and you can see that I have a little arrow that goes back up to theory there. That's saying that sometimes you just maybe are wrong and you didn't actually find any support for anything you were hypothesizing. So you might just start right then and go back and say, maybe I didn't do this study very well. I need to go back to my theory and figure it out. Or it could be that you found something really interesting, and therefore you would just move further down and write a report about it and go ahead and talk about your results. And we're going to be talking a lot about writing reports later on in the semester. We'll be talking about different aspects of this as we move along. All right, so basically, as I said, we're going to want to take this data then to evaluate our theories and our hypotheses. And as I've already mentioned, our scientific theories have to be falsifiable. We have to have a way of knowing whether they're right or wrong. You can't just come up with a theory that is impossible to ever disprove, right? So scientific theories have to be falsifiable. You also don't really want to have a lot of after-the-fact explanations. It's better to make predictions beforehand, run your study, and see if your predictions are held up. If instead you just go ahead and collect a lot of data and then you go ahead and afterwards say, well, this is what I really think is going on, it's kind of like being able to guess the results of a bet after you already know what the outcome of the bet is. You need to be able to make these predictions beforehand in order to test your theory. So you want to formulate a theory, make a prediction, see if the prediction comes true. If yes, then your theory is supported. If no, then your theory is not supported. It's as simple as it is. So you're just going to go ahead and make a prediction, see if your theory is supported or not, and then report that result. There are bad hypotheses, by the way, out there. There are bad ways of doing all this. So for instance, one real problem that people can come up with is they can create circular hypotheses. These are basically hypotheses that just rename the phenomenon without providing any additional explanation. So for instance, you could say something like, the global economic crisis was brought about by mass economic panic. Well, that's basically the same thing, right? The economic crisis is a mass economic panic. So you're not really actually saying anything at all. It's all circular because you're just renaming the phenomenon without providing any explanation. Other kinds of bad hypotheses would be hypotheses that contain non-scientific ideas or forces. So basically it's saying like someone did something because he was possessed by the devil. Well, there's not really any way that you can prove whether the devil's there or not. That's not a scientific kind of question to look at. It's untestable because we can't actually objectively measure the influence of the devil. So that would not be something that you could actually test as a psychological question. Hypotheses that contain ill-defined terms. This means that we need to be very precise in defining the terms associated with our hypotheses. If you say something like your son's distractible in school, you want to be able to explain exactly what you mean by that. What does it mean to be distractible in school? So you want to have a measure or a way of precisely defining distractibility, for example. So hypotheses have to have well-defined terms, and if they don't, if they have these ill-defined terms, it's going to be very bad to run that kind of research. So that means then, therefore, the good theories are falsifiable, that good theories are not circular, and they don't contain non-scientific ideas or forces, and they contain precise definitions of the associated terms and concepts. There's one other good feature I want to mention about good theories, and is that good theories should also have parsimony. And parsimony is this principle that just says basically, if I've got two or more explanations for a phenomenon that all sound equally good, they can all equally do a good job of explaining it, we prefer the simplest explanation. So parsimony is the preference for a simple explanation over a more complicated one. So that basically saying is that both the simple and the complex could both account for this phenomenon, this theory. But if one theory is really simple to understand and it doesn't require a lot of assumptions, and it does just as good of a job as a more complicated one, we prefer the simpler explanation, and that's what we call parsimony. All right. I'm going to go ahead and move on a little bit now and talk about what I call the 4 pillars of this course. And these 4 pillars are 4 things that I believe are going to be important for you to get throughout the entire semester. Okay, so as we talk about research methodology, I'm going to go ahead and say there are these 4 main things that you need to pay attention to. All right, so the 4 main things that we're going to come back to again and again are hypothesis testing, which we've talked about a bit today, the sample size, power, and effect size. So those are our 4 pillars: hypothesis testing, sample size, power, and effect size. So hypothesis testing, as I said, we've already talked about this. It's about setting up the null and the alternative hypothesis. It's about collecting data then and evaluating the statistics and then deciding whether the finding that we have is rare enough to reject the null hypothesis. And this is where we come up with something like the probability is less than 0.05. That means that we have a significant result. That's all about hypothesis testing. So that's what we mean by that, and it's going to be very important for you to get it down and understand it because we're going to cover it again and again throughout the semester. The second pillar is the sample size, and this is the number of participants in your study. So you run an experiment, and you're going to have maybe a group of people in the control group, a group of people in the experimental group. The question is, what should the number of participants be? What determines this number? That's the sample size. Now, very often, the answer to that question is you just do what you can afford. Like if it's going to be very costly to test people that have a particular kind of skill or a particular brain injury, it's going to limit the number of people that you can test. And maybe you don't have enough money for fMRI scans or whatever it happens to be. You could say the resources you have available to you determines the number of participants in your study. But there are also guidelines and research out there that tell us how many participants we should have in a study. And I'll just jump to the quick right now and tell you that probably for many decades now, psychologists have been not adequately having big enough sample sizes in their experiments. So they've been running their experiments with too few people. And new research is suggesting that we should be testing with greater numbers of people in our studies. So that's what the newer guidelines are. And I'll talk more about that later. Third thing is power. Power is a statistical term here, and it's the stability that you have to correctly reject the null hypothesis. So remember, the null hypothesis states that there is no relationship between x and y. And what you typically want to do is be able to reject that so that you can say there actually is an effect between x and y. Well, your statistical ability to do that is known as power. And what we try to do in our studies is have as much power as possible so that we can really detect effects that are there. If there really was an effect and you didn't have enough power, you might end up concluding there's nothing going on, when in fact there actually is. So you want to have as much power as you can in your research. The fourth pillar is the effect size. And the effect size is basically what the effect is of X on Y. Is it a little effect? Is it small? Is it a medium effect of X on Y? Is it a huge effect? And the question is that you have to be able to get a good sense of this, how big an effect that you have. It's going to determine a lot of things that go on in our research, whether we're dealing with something that's just a small effect or a large effect. And so you're going to need to be able to assess and know whether or not you have a large, small, medium, or effect size. So those are the 4 pillars: hypothesis testing, sample size, power, and effect size. We will go over these again in subsequent lectures, but I wanted to introduce them to you today so you start thinking about them. Okay, let's go ahead and turn now to the final topic for today's lecture, which is to talk about an article that I want to have you read next and that we will talk about at the first workshop. And it's this thing that's known as the current replicability crisis, okay? So replicability refers to the idea that if I run an experiment and I find some results and I publish it in an article, I would expect, because of openness in science, that somebody else should be able to read my article and replicate it, be able to go through and do exactly the same thing and find the same exact results. That's what replicability means. But as my slide says here, there is actually something going on called the replicability crisis. And before I tell you actually what the crisis is, it's not something that just popped up in the last year or so. It's something we've been kind of watching carefully for the last 10 years. And that critics have noted some questionable research practices among psychologists. And by the way, I should say this isn't just psychologists. It probably extends to medical researchers and others as well. So one of these questionable practices that people have noticed in psychology is what's known as selective reporting or partial publication of their data. What this refers to is that sometimes when people run a research study, they'll have maybe 15 different questionnaires and lots of different things they're testing. And when they run their analyses, they find that maybe only 2 or 3 of the questionnaires actually show them some significant results. And so what they do is they end up just reporting just those questionnaires in their results section, and almost as if they never even tested those other things on the participants. So what they're doing is they're kind of creating this image that, you know, they were really only just focused on these 2 or 3 things that came out, and they ignore reporting to the reader and to the other scientists that there were another 10 things that they did that didn't come out. And so that's called selective reporting or partial publication of their data. It misleads the reader, misleads scientists in thinking that those other things could possibly have worked out, but since you didn't report them, you don't know that. Another questionable practice is what's known as optional stopping. Optional stopping refers to the sample size. And so what this means is that some people will say, I'm going to go ahead and collect 30 research participants in my study. So they go ahead and do their experiment, and they collect 30 people. They run some analyses, and they say, oh, look at that. My result's almost significant. If I were to run 5 more people, then maybe I'll get a significant result. So they go ahead and test 5 more people, and as soon as they have a significant result, they stop at 35. That's called optional stopping. That's basically saying that you're going to decide that you're just going to keep testing people until you get a significant result, and that determines your sample size. So you keep testing statistically every time you get another 5 people, another 10 people, and then you stop as soon as you have a significant result. That's considered a questionable research practice. Another one's called p-value rounding. This has to do with something really silly. Remember I told you that we usually use as our level of significance a p-value of 0.05. Well, some people will get like a p-value that comes out to be 0.054 or 0.058, and they'll say, well, that's close enough to 0.05. I'll round it down and say that my result was at 0.05, when in fact it wasn't. So they're just kind of rounding to make it look like they have an effect when they actually don't. Another questionable research practice we have out there is known as the file drawer effect. The file drawer effect is the problem that when we don't find a significant result, we typically don't get to publish the research. So many journals that are out there in psychology only like to find significant results when you find support for your hypothesis. If you don't find support for your hypothesis, they don't typically want to see it in their journal, and so people never get their research published, and they ostensibly stick it into a file drawer, and no one ever knows that the research was done. The problem then with file drawer effects is that you may think then that when you look in the journal that there's then these 5 studies that all found this effect, but you're not aware of the fact that there maybe was another 20 out there that also tried to find the effect but didn't. And when they didn't find it, they stuck it in their file drawer and it was never found. And so we get this bias in our findings that makes it look like we have a finding that we don't actually find as reliably as it actually looks. Excuse me again. Post hoc storytelling is this thing I was talking about after the fact, where you basically run your study and then after the fact change your hypotheses or your theory to now account for your data. I told you before, the better thing to do is to go ahead and make predictions beforehand, before you run the study, and then say whether or not you found the results. And the last thing is manipulation of outliers. And the idea behind manipulation of outliers is that sometimes you'll get one person who gives you completely a different result from everybody else. And what people do is they include that person in their analysis and see if it makes a difference. And if they don't like the result, they get rid of the person. And so they change it again. And so this is just a way of dealing with people who may not fit with your hypotheses. Are you going to include them or not? And you look to see how that affects your overall results. All of these things, again, we're going to talk about more as we move along throughout the semester, but I want you to get introduced to them today. Now, the crisis itself has culminated with an article that was published about a year ago in the journal Science, which is one of our top journals in science and all sciences. So in August 2015, you can see this paper was published estimating the reproducibility of psychological science. In this study, they went ahead and looked at 100 experimental and correlational studies that have been published in 3 of our top psychology journals. And what they did is they asked researchers around the world to try to replicate each of those 100 studies. So different teams of people would take this study or that study or that study, and they contacted the authors of the original article and asked them for guidance to help them, maybe if there were all the instructions weren't there. Because you remember, science is about openness, and so you're supposed to share your methods and what you did in your actual research. So they did that. They tried to contact all those people. Most people complied. Some people never answered, but then they tried to run a replication. And when they ran the replication, what they found was that only 39% of all of the studies that they did actually had significant results. So that is, most of the studies didn't replicate. They weren't able to get the same result as the original study. Now, this is in some of our best journals in psychology, and they were only published a few years ago. So it's quite a shock to all of us to learn that our top psychological research, much of it isn't being replicated, that you can't actually get the same result reproduced in your laboratory. And that's what's caused the crisis. That's what causes people now to wring their hands and say, what's going on in psychology? Why is this happening? And you'll see there's a lot of tables and a lot of analyses in this article. I've assigned the article for you to read this week. You should read it, and read it before you go to take the quiz. Also, you'll see that I've asked you to read it in preparation for the workshop. And what I'd like you to do is read through the article and see if you can come up with 3 questions from the article about things that you're confused about or that you want to talk about more when we get to the workshop. It's not a very long article. It's up on Blackboard. It's only a few pages long. A lot of the terms, of course, are going to be beyond you right now, but some of these things like effect sizes and stuff like that, I've already talked to you about what those are a little bit, and I hope that you can understand a lot of what's going on in the actual article. So far what we've done is we've introduced the scientific method as a way of knowing. We've talked about the principles of science, the goals of science, the scientific process, and how we evaluate hypotheses and theories, as well as introduce this replicability crisis to you. And I hope that you'll go ahead and revise your notes from this lecture, and again, read the article that's been assigned before you take the quiz. Quiz number 1 is going to be available starting on Wednesday, July 27th, and you'll have 5 days when you can possibly take it, and you need to have it completed before you go to your workshop then in week number 2. Before that, it closes on Monday at noon. So the idea is to go ahead and watch this lecture, take the quiz prior to coming to that workshop. All right, so next week what we'll be doing is we'll be talking more about methods and experiments. And that's all I have for today. Thank you.